So let's dive in because the major themes of today's conversation have been around marketing and sales alignment and using technology to help us in each stage of the customer journey. But a big factor that we cannot overlook is the human touch points and building relationships and trust in this industry. And that's why I am excited for Reed with One on One Sales Academy to join us for this third live session today. Reed is the Chief Learning Officer at One on One Sales Academy, and with over 22 years of experience in senior living, Reed is leading the charge in transforming senior living sales. He has coached and trained sales professionals across the United States, Canada, and the UK, and he is on a mission to elevate sales teams, increase ratios, and create meaningful lifestyles for older adults. So, welcome, Reed. I'm so excited that you're here today.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I look forward to hearing all the great tips you have for staying human in this highly technology driven space.
I know. I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, it's all we hear about these days, right? Is the technology and AI and there's so much, I think, information about that coming at us in such a rapid pace that it's hard to keep up on. And I know for myself, it's a little bit overwhelming. And I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily the most tech savvy person. I'm not the least tech savvy person. But when I hear everything about AI and I watched Samay's presentation earlier and it was fantastic. It's just that there's so much information. And so what I really hope to do today is kind of look at how can we use that from the standpoint of being able to help us sell, but also while still remaining human and understanding that no matter how much technology is out there, that this particular sales process in senior living is so deeply human that there's some good things that we can use AI on, but we can't become reliant on it to help us through the sales process. So that's kind of what I hope to decipher today. I wanted to start out a little bit and tell you guys about the Academy. We are a new company. We actually just launched this month in July. In the Sales Academy, what we're really focusing on is providing ongoing education opportunities for everybody in the sales on sales teams, no matter what level you are, whether you're a move-in coordinator, an operations director, an executive director, a sales director, on up from the regionals to the VPs. One of the things that we identified is that there's a lot of opportunities for training, and a lot of companies do a great job with training, with onboarding, maybe with some training opportunities for their teams. A lot of companies do a really great job from a coaching standpoint. There's a lot of sales support, there's regional support, there's home office support, corporate, whatever you call it. But there's very few opportunities for ongoing education from the sales side. Executive directors have to take CEUs, nurses have to take CEUs to keep their licenses up. Oftentimes, the kitchen has to take CEUs for food safety and health and safety of food handling and all of that. But in sales, there's not a whole lot of ongoing education, which I love that Smart Girl Digital is putting together this forum or this summit today because I think it's an awesome opportunity for our industry to be able to come together and be able to learn and grow from, Sonia's presentation this morning on marketing and how that can help to May talking about how AI is starting to be introduced to now me being able to talk about kind of the human side of the sales process. So thank you to Smart Gold Digital for giving me the opportunity. I welcome your feedback throughout the presentation. I'm not going to be able to see the chat or the Q&A, but Katie will break in at any point and be able to kind of give me those updates or those questions. Happy to answer anything as we go. As always, when I present, just feel free to interrupt, Katie.
Okay.
This is not my first rodeo, as they say. It takes quite a bit to throw me off my rhythm, but I'm happy to answer any questions. It's always a little bit more fun than just sitting here talking to everybody for the next 40 minutes. But so today, what we're going to be talking about is what you see here, right? AI versus sales. What can we do from a technology standpoint? What can we do from a human standpoint? And how does that help? And so I wanted to start with this picture. There was actually, and I don't remember if it was Matt Rainers that started it or somebody on LinkedIn started this thing, I think back in maybe like October. And the challenge, so to speak, I sound like one of my kids with these YouTube challenges or whatever, but the challenge was, to ask AI or to ask Chat GPT, that's the one that I use, based off of what you know about me, paint a picture. And this is what it painted for me. And while there's a lot of things that I think are
Hey,
fairly
Reed, real
accurate,
quick.
yeah.
Can you make that larger for us on the screen? I think
Ooh.
we're seeing kind of your slides. I don't know if your screen share
Let me see
be
if my
larger.
screen
I just
share.
needed to see all that glory in that AI graphic that you created.
So let's see. Is that better?
Yes, there it
Okay.
is. Now it's full screen.
Weird. Okay.
Okay.
Technology, folks, right? Like,
Yeah.
um, so yeah. So anyway, so this is the picture that it painted for me. And the reason I wanted to start with this is because as wonderful as AI is, and as many great things that it can do, to May's point earlier too, it's not always that accurate. My view of AI, and granted, I would say a pretty limited understanding of it outside of what I use it for and how I use it on kind of a daily basis. But my view of it is that it's kind of a collection of information, a collection of facts. It learns. The more you put into it, the more you get out of it. And so, what I thought was really funny is that this picture, although pretty accurate, depicts me, I would assume from this, as a woman. I'm not, if you haven't noticed. It does some really great things. We are a soccer family. We do have four of the five of us that live in my house. Our birthdays are in October. I do have a daughter named Delaney, like it says on the newspaper right there. Um, but I'm not really that infatuated with late model sedans as this would kind
Oh,
of depict me being. And we also are a baseball and a softball family, which is not mentioned anywhere in there. And then it also left out one of my kids.
oh.
So when we look at it, the real life picture of me, if you kind of took in a collection of photographs, this is what it would look like. I have a wonderful wife. I don't drive a late model sedan, as you can see in the big picture or in the picture down below. I drive a big truck. Um, my wife has a big SUV. We have a daughter that plays softball. We have two chocolate labs that we love very much. We're very much a softball and a baseball family, as much as we are a soccer family. We love to be outdoors and hunt and fish. And a big thing that I consider a pretty big part of my life is that I do a pretty mean Ted Lasso impersonation, which actually raises millions of dollars every May by growing a mustache for kids' charities here locally. And so my point is that although AI is wonderful, you only get out as good at information as you put in. Now, maybe I haven't talked to AI much about my hunting. I would imagine I've put in quite a bit about softball and baseball because I've modeled practice plans through it. But my point is that it doesn't always bring everything out. And so when we think about our processes, one of the things that I thought was fantastic about what Samay was talking about earlier was that, it draws all this information out of the CRM. And listen, I'm going to say this as a fellow salesperson. I am not necessarily the best person ever about using my CRM. So if we want to be able to enjoy the technology and for the accurate picture to be painted that it looks more like this than like this, it requires us putting that information in And that's only as good of information as that we can pull out. The old adage when you talk about a CRM is garbage in and garbage out. I like to say gold in and gold out. If we want to be able to leverage the technology that we have these days, if we want to be able to leverage AI and to be able to help us use it to sell, we have to be able to collect the information and put it in and take the time to be able to do that. And so
Well, what
as
a great motivating factor, Reed, for anybody who does struggle with putting that data into the CRM. Like, wow, if I just put the data in, I can have these tools help, streamline some of the follow up or some of the next steps or some of those things. So we could look at like AI as a motivator for putting those details into the CRM.
Yeah. And when, there's a lot of great data that, Align puts out a data report, Welcome Home puts out a data report. And so there's a lot of data about what it takes to get a sale or what it takes to be able to move people in. But the problem is that if we're having AI be able to help us with that, or even just we're using it on our own to go and extract data, or your regional comes in to be able to help you in the sales process, look at who should we be calling next, what opportunities do we have. If you haven't put in all of your phone calls or your emails, or a detailed account of who that person is and that prospect, then it won't do us much good. It won't do the technology any good. It won't do us good as we're coming in and trying to help, or a sales coach is coming in and trying to help. And so it's important to be able to get that information in. And when we look at the industry, there's a huge opportunity, I think, for us as an industry to be able to help more older adults. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I can't speak for anybody else in the industry, but I know for David Smith and I, our ultimate goal with creating the Sales Academy was to be able to help salespeople so that they could help more older adults. Because when we look at it, according to a study from ProMatura in 2024, only 8% of the leads that inquired actually moved in.
Wow.
Yeah, which is staggering.
Yeah.
And what's even more staggering is if you consider, if we move that up to just 13 to 15%, we could
Mm-hmm.
fill every open senior living apartment in the industry. And so if we could just get that up just a little bit, right, and be able to continue to increase that, if we could get that to, imagine if we could get that to 10% and then 11% and then 12%, how much better off our industry would be because we'd be helping so many more older adults.
Yep.
So I think the important question is then why do people buy? And looking at, what is it that actually draws them? Not necessarily what drives them to reach out, but it's what about the sales process actually helps a prospect choose a community. And so there was a survey done by Promature again that looked at, what is it that actually is important to the buyer in the selling process, and what is it that makes them more likely to buy? And what they found was that the top three reasons had nothing to do with your location, with your cost, with your apartment sizes, with your features, benefits and amenities. What it actually had to do with was 64% of the reason why people chose a particular community was either based on how that sales process and that salesperson made them feel, how personally specific the process was to them, and how much trust they built with that person. And so,
Wow.
what I want to do today is I want to go through and kind of look at each of those three things and be able to show you how can we use, and I don't even want to say leverage, but how can we tap into those three really important parts of the sales process? Because what I find is that, we all do a really good job with selling our features, benefits, and amenities. We all do a really good job, and we have a great resource center for, sales support, for move counsel, for anything like that. To Samay's point, some of that sales follow-up, is something that AI can help with, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The value differentiation. We all have our, why are we more valuable than the competitor? But let's talk about the number one thing, right? Because the number one thing that we find that really makes a difference in the sales process. In fact, it's about a quarter of what drives the decision is emotion. And when we talk about emotion, what I use, I love to use this graphic because this graphic, I think, speaks so loudly to me. Because if you have a prospect, and we name this guy George, and George is kind of standing on the side of the bridge, this kind of big chasm, and he's standing over there on his side with his house that he's lived in for a long time. It has all of his memories packed into it. It's probably paid off. There's a lot of things that George absolutely loves about his house, but something has said to him, this just isn't working anymore. And so it motivates him enough to at least call a senior living community. But when we think about, what either motivates people to make a change or what holds people back from making a change, is oftentimes it's emotion. And a lot of times that emotion in a prospect is fear. And what they're fearing is they're fearing change, loss of control, loss of identity. They're fearing coming to grips with aging. Sometimes it's not only coming to grips with aging, but it's also living with old people. They might not, George might not view himself as 82 or 83 years old, but when he walks into your community and he's faced with a dining room full of older folks, he goes, "Oh, whew, those people look old," right? Or the fear of the loss of familiarity, where he knows his home, he knows his neighborhood, moving into a new place, although it might be this big, beautiful community, it can be really intimidating, especially when we look at the fact that a lot of our prospects haven't necessarily lived in kind of a congregate living setting. When we look at when they went to college, they might not have necessarily lived in dorms, or they were starting to get to that age, but they haven't necessarily lived in dorms. A lot of them haven't lived in apartments. And so just going down to eat breakfast with 100 people can be really intimidating when you've been used to just getting up, getting in your robe, walking out the front door, grabbing the newspaper, and sitting down with a cup of coffee at your dining room table. And so when we think about that, we think about kind of, you know, that emotion and that resistance that we end up hearing. And, that comes in some different forms. It comes in, "I'm not ready." It comes in, "I'm never moving. I don't know why my daughter reached out to you." Or what I'm always reminded of when I see this slide, and I like to call this lady Noreen because Noreen was my grandmother's name and she was just a little bit feisty. And this is the person that reaches out to you and says, "How much does your community cost?" And so you tell her, and she goes, "Oh my God, how do you sleep at night charging old people that much money?" And she hangs up on you, and you're like, "I swear she called me. I didn't just call her out of the blue." And so when we think about all of that fear, or we think about their prospects that are just looking for a reason not to move in, that's where we get some of that resistance. And so, what we can do can either help, I think, kind of build that resistance or break down some of those walls to resistance. And when we look at it, we looked at, right, the 8% of people that reach out, only 8% move in. And when there was a study done by the American Journal for Seniors Housing, they did a study and found that only about 10% of people are actually willing and not ready, but willing to move into senior living at some point. They found that 90% of people plan to spend the rest of their life at the same place they did when they on their 75th birthday, and that's home. And so, as salespeople, I think we have the opportunity in how we follow up and how we listen and how we dive in that can either sometimes kind of build up some of those walls or tear those down. And so I like to show this video. It's actually from TikTok, which makes me excited that we're in 2025 and we're leveraging technology and we're using TikTok as an example. But I thought this was such a great job because, as we'll find out later, how AI can help kind of reword or relanguage what we do. We need to pay attention about what we sound like when we follow up. Use the word follow up. So when you call back a prospect that maybe didn't buy, and you're calling back 3 months, like, "Hey, Sean, I was just following up with you." Like when you get an email, because you get emails, right? So you get the emails that are like 3 or 4 paragraphs long, and the first sentence is like, "Hey, just checking in."
They'd already talked to you, just checking in. Immediately, what do you think? Yeah, because you think they're just trying to sell me something. So those are trigger words. So you've got to relanguage some of your words where they're a little bit more neutral. Like, hey, John, I know we spoke a couple months ago about you guys looking at getting a higher quality leads and you scale to $10 million a month. You guys given up on that, or what actually happened? See, now I'm focused on the problem and the objective, whereas the other guy was like, oh, I'm just checking in to see where we're at with your XYZ. Like, that's just a trigger word. So you're going to trigger sales resistance. And so many salespeople trigger sales resistance where the guard comes up. And I'm like, why don't you learn how to get them to let their guard down? Because then it becomes really easy to sell.
And what I love about that is I call it like the F word or the FU word. And it's not the one that probably my 9-year-old thinks of when he hears me say that and snickers to himself, but the word follow up. I hate the word follow up. And one of the ways that I absolutely love to use AI is especially on those days where I'm tired, it's the end of the day. I know I have to actually follow up, in technical terms of being able to do that because I have the people in my CRM and I go into Chat GPT and I put in the information and I say, I want to follow up with this person, but I don't want to use the word follow up or check in and be able to help generate and spark some ideas for me to be able to send an email out so that I'm not like everybody else. Because what we find is that people that inquire online have looked at 10 to 12 places. They may have called 6 to 8. And so we're trying to stand out in the crowd. And what you find is that, if they reach out to 8 places, you're going to have 8 people calling you back saying, I'm just calling to check in. I'm just calling to follow up. So how do we re-language to be able to sound different? Because when we think about, our prospect is really kind of sitting in that ambivalence. They're feeling 2 ways about the same thing. And depending on how we approach them, depends on which side of that we push them to. And so when you're feeling ambivalent about something, you're feeling 2 ways. And a lot of our prospects are thinking about, well, I could either move to the senior living community or I could stay home. And the problem is that I find with salespeople is that we rely too much on selling our product, which oftentimes, as research has shown, pushes somebody to the other side of the issue that they're feeling ambivalent about. And when there was a
Well,
study done, oh, sorry, go ahead.
well, I was just going to add to this, just because as we think about the people who we are talking to on the sales side, they didn't make an inquiry or engage with that chatbot or any of the ways that you got their information. Something triggered them to go out and start looking. Nobody is out there casually browsing senior living websites or casually walking in if they haven't identified that maybe potentially at some point this might be an option for me. And maybe they're curious and earlier in that journey and we got to meet them there, or maybe they've got some other things going on and that are necessitating that change. So that ambivalence is definitely there, but we wouldn't have them in this on the sales side. We wouldn't have their information to be talking to them and creating that relationship if there wasn't something that in their world that kind of initiated that curiosity for them to inquire.
Yeah, hey, my partner David Smith has one of my favorite sayings ever when you think about that in that perspective, Katie, and it's that nobody in a perfectly happy marriage has ever reached out to a divorce attorney just to see what the process is and how much it costs. I wish I could claim that for my own, but it's so true when we think about it because people don't reach out, right? When we look at why people reach out, what we call that is their motivators. So when we look at ambivalence, right, there's 2 sides to ambivalence. There's the motivators and the objections. And so when we look at the motivators, this is somebody that said, motivator for reaching out, the reason why they inquired was because their house was too much. But the very same person said that the objection and why they aren't moving right now is because they love their house that's too much, right? Or the one that we always hear a lot of times, I have too much stuff that I don't need anymore. I have a basement full of stuff that I haven't used for a while because I don't even go down there, but I don't know what to do with it. And the problem that I find is that with salespeople is that we see that objection and we're so busy trying to overcome that objection that we don't bother to further explore the motivator. And so the more you talk about the objection, then they pushes them further back and said, well, we have we have a downsizer, we have somebody that can come in and help you clean your stuff out. And that gets them to kind of lean on that side and go further into that objection. Well, I'm not really sure if I'm ready to get rid of my stuff. And so it's how we approach that and how we identify those things that make such a huge difference. And when we think about kind of how the human brain works, and we're going to look at this from the standpoint of the prospect, and we're going to look at it from the standpoint of the sales counselor, is that, the right side of the brain is the emotional part, right? The left side of the brain is the logic. So the left side of the brain says, hey, this house is too much. I'm not sure that I can take care of it anymore. But the emotion kicks in, and that's what stops you from making that decision. And the emotion says, well, hey, listen, like you could probably get by a little bit longer. You've gotten by this far, don't give up those memories. And so when we think about how do we do that, how do we really dive into those things? The second part that makes a huge difference in the sales process is that personal specificity. And so these are things, some ideas that we can do to kind of really help start to get to where we're starting to build that trust. But in the way I think about personal specificity is, yes, it's the way that we make the process individual, but we won't know how to do that unless we listen. And so there's this really great quote from Susan Cain, and what she said is, we have two ears and one mouth, and we should use them proportionately. And so when we think about personal specificity, or even about listening for emotion, right? Listening for those motivators versus objections, it takes us to really be able to kind of listen with an open and a clear mind. Dr. William Miller, who was co-creator of motivational interviewing, one of the world's leading thought leaders on ambivalence, and has written many books about it, wrote a book called Listening Well. It's the art of empathic understanding. And what he talks about in there is really listening with purpose, and listening without the purpose of trying to solve, but listening to really understand. And what Stephen Covey in the seven, if you haven't read the Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, I highly recommend that you do. But he said most people do not listen with the intent to understand, they listen with the intent to reply. And so it's important to be able to understand that even in the way that we ask questions, sometimes we create our own roadblocks, right? And as salespeople, we take this kind of one up stance where we want to tell people what they should be doing, or pointing out why living at home isn't good anymore. And we don't take the time to truly listen and understand why they're motivated to be able to make that change. And so one of the things I heard at a sales training last year was, don't let your rut become your routine. And I always thought
Ooh,
I was trying to do what now?
ooh, that's good.
Yeah, yeah, right. Don't let your rut become your routine. And what's funny is, I scoured the internet for pictures, and I'm like, how can I figure out a picture for, getting like this? I just think of this like wagon getting bogged down in the mud. And you know what I did? Went to Chat GPT and said, hey, give me a picture of a horse-drawn carriage driving down a muddy street in a western town getting stuck, and this is what it gave me. Um,
Now the image exists in the internet.
yeah, yeah. Now the image, you're welcome, everybody who's looking for something. And what I'm talking about is, like, as we kind of go, I think what happens is we start to pick up speed in the sales process. And we start to really try to move at this pace because we're trying to get through all of the leads, and our marketing team's doing a really good job. And we just get going at such a pace that we don't slow ourselves down enough to allow ourselves to really truly listen without any intention. And to really kind of, we don't allow ourselves to detach ourselves from the outcome enough to be able to really truly try to help the person. And what we call that is being a guide. And it's something that Dr. Miller spoke with us last week when we did a webinar with him about, when you're guiding change. And I think that's what we are as salespeople, is that we're a change agent. As he said, we need to look at ourselves as more of a guide. Like, if you go to a foreign country, a guide doesn't pull you around. They don't tell you what you're going to be doing. They don't follow you as you kind of try to navigate your way through the streets. What they do is they ask you questions to be able to find out what's your intention. How would you like the trip to go? What would you like the cost to be? What do you want to do? What does your agenda look like? How busy do you want to be? And they ask you all of these questions. And what they do is then they build this experience around what you like and your personality. And imagine if we did that from the sales process and we allowed ourselves to act more like a guide than a director. And so in order to do that, I think, we have to be able to kind of listen empathically and we have to be able to really let go. When I talk about letting go of the result, there's a really great book called I have it right here called Practical Empathy, and it's by Indy Young. And one of the things that she talks about is she talks about taking this toddler mindset because a toddler always asks why, and they come at things with this kind of empty-minded approach of genuine curiosity and wanting to be able to know and understand and see how that feels. I was on a run yesterday, and my kids have started going with me, and my 9-year-old was running right next to me, and he just out of the blue said, "Hey, what's your biggest fear?" And I was like, "Ooh."
Oh,
You're right. Yeah, like it kind of
no.
took me back for a second, and I answered him and I told him, and he goes, "You know what mine is?" And I said, "What's that, buddy?" And he was like, "My biggest fear is you guys dying before I grow up." And I was like, "Oh, talk about like a heavy moment at 6:30 a.m. and you're sweating and it's hot." But really taking that approach and not being fearful to ask those questions. And from a salesperson standpoint, I think we need to be able to have less fear about what the answer is going to be and to take the approach of like, hey, tell me more about that. Or why is that? Or what do you mean by that? Or what are you thinking there? Right?
Yeah.
And understanding that we have this like unbelievable ability. And by doing that, we can follow up with people in a more meaningful way. Sameh was talking about, the creative follow-up, and he said the problem that they were finding, and I love that he said this, my heart skipped a beat. I was happy, rejoicing, like singing and dancing
Yeah.
at my desk, was when he said the problem that we found is that when people were doing this creative follow-up, it wasn't really that thoughtful and wasn't really that creative, and it was really just kind of surface level. And he said, since people have taken some prompts from AI and from, just thinking about it a little bit longer, is that they've had these incredible results, and that people, when they have true creative follow-up, are like 40% more likely to put down a deposit and to get a sale. And it's incredible to me that he found that out because that is exactly what we're talking about. And now, while AI can help you with some of that, that's a deeply human emotion to say, hey, listen, I see you and hear you for who you are, and nothing says I'm listening with my whole heart like following up with something that they said. Now, granted, we're not going to be able to buy people guitars and pianos, like you said, but sometimes some of that simple creative follow-up can just be as simple as a handwritten note in the language that the person loves to speak. And so, this is an example that one of my salespeople did a couple of years ago in Iowa, and they had a gentleman when he came in, he spoke a lot of Italian. And so simply what they did was they just went to Google. You could actually do it in Chat GPT. I used it to translate into Spanish for creative follow-up for an executive director that I was coaching, that was her primary language. And I thought, what a way to be able to kind of say, hey, I hear you and see you, to be able to send her my follow-up email in Spanish. I did the same thing. But they just went and said, hey, how do you say such and such in Italian? And it spit it out, and they put it on a handwritten card, and they said, Harold, thank you so much for stopping by our community Monday afternoon. And in Italian, they said something to the effect of, we really appreciate your time and we hope to see you again soon. And what it did was it drove him to immediately call back the community. And think about the amount of trust that that accelerated in that process. And its creative follow-up is really easy. It just takes you being present, listening, sometimes not taking yourself too seriously, and then one size fits one, right? So we're coming up on holiday season. Pumpkin pie is not a creative follow-up. but something that might be. And an example that I did is I have a profile that I came up with, kind of a collection of my grandparents and some of my favorite prospects that I've ever worked with. And I use it for training purposes. And so all I did was simply uploaded that profile the same way that even if you don't use, Samay's company and you just use Chat GPT, to be able to put in the prospect profile in the Chat GPT and say, hey, give me some creative follow-up ideas. It came up with three really great creative follow-up ideas, and these are it right here. Again, it could be used if you're not maybe necessarily the most like creative person. If you're in a little bit of a funk or it's the end of the day and you just aren't feeling that creative and thoughtful, you can be able to do that. But the thing is what it does is it comes down to that third part, which is it just helps build trust. And when we think about trust from like the sales process, I was actually surprised that this wasn't a little bit higher on the list, although you could say kind of trust is an emotion. And so, because your prospects are looking at you going, hey, listen, can I trust you? And these people are successful. If they can afford to live in your communities, they can certainly afford to live home. And they've certainly had a successful life. A lot of them have been in business. They can smell the BS from kind of a mile away. And so when we think about like the definition of trust, to me, the words that stand out here is authenticity and honesty. And that's really what it boils down to is that you're being your authentic self and you're genuinely curious about being able to help them. And when we think about kind of the three key strategies for building trust, it's really simple. It's a three-part process, right? It requires empathy. And listen, I can tell you, I'm not the most empathetic person, but you can learn to be more empathetic, right? It takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of kind of personal awareness, but you can do that. It takes stating your intentions, letting them know kind of the why and the what behind what you're doing. And it takes then you demonstrating your commitment to that. So if you're truly saying, listen, I'm here to help you whether or not you move here, and then you turn around and everything is geared towards move in by the end of the month, we've got this great special, then you haven't demonstrated your commitment to your statement of intentions. You haven't taken the time to listen. And when we think about time, I think the best way you can demonstrate your commitment is by following this really kind of easy three-step sales process. And what it takes is you being able to connect, being able to untangle in advance. But the problem is that as salespeople, we don't take enough time to open. We want to connect and hurry up and get to it. Let's qualify or disqualify. And then we want to move right into advance because that's what our regionals want. That's what our sales leaders want. But we find the most successful people follow this process and really take the time to be able to get to know their prospects. But what it does is that it takes us as a salesperson kind of dealing with our fears, right? It takes us to stop kind of standing on our side of the bridge here. We had George earlier on his side of the bridge. We have our sales director here on our side of the bridge. And I think a lot of times what stops us from digging in and kind of untangling and getting to some of those questions and maybe even asking a question like Crawford asked to me, yesterday morning of, what are you most scared of? Imagine if we asked a prospect that. But I think a lot of times as salespeople, we're trying to protect ourselves from failure, from vulnerability, from rejection. And I thought it was really kind of interesting earlier because when Samay was talking, he was saying, what they found is that a lot of times when leads are unresponsive, salespeople kind of take that as rejection. And instead of doing that, what if we sat in that and said, you know what? They're not rejecting me. They're trying to figure out the emotion that goes with giving up their house of 50 years, having to downsize all of their things to be able to kind of step foot across this really scary bridge. And it takes a little bit of intimacy on our standpoint to be able to open ourselves up to that relationship. Because just like our prospects, right, who are kind of dealing with things and looking at the logic, the facts, the fear, and then, kind of dealing with the emotions of it. I think as salespeople, Rarely do I ever do a sales training where somebody is like, I'm totally like left brain person. Most salespeople are kind of that right brain, that, all color, emotion, curiosity. We love a good story. But I think what we go to, and when we're in a stressful situation, is we rely on logic. We rely on the building and how beautiful it is and the size of our apartments rather than kind of digging in deep. And we let our fear kind of take over and we go, oh, hey, listen, like, if I ask this question, I'm really worried I'm going to offend them. Or we kind of let that ego side of it take over. And I don't necessarily mean ego from a bad thing. I'll tell you guys, I have a little bit of an ego myself. I don't like to be not liked. I hate to do a poor job for somebody. I don't like getting negative feedback. But your ego also says, I want to stay in control and to not be vulnerable. And so to protect myself against failure or rejection, I'm not going to put myself out on that limb because if I ask for that home visit, they're going to tell me no. Or if I ask that tough question, or if I ask them, what they're most fearful of, they're going to reject me. And so we go to this like logical place where we go, you know what, I don't want to be vulnerable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to appeal to their logic and let them know that we have the one, last two-bedroom open and it faces west. It's the view they wanted. And, why don't we invite them back in for breakfast instead of trying to cross over that bridge and go to their side? And I always think to myself, like, what if we let curiosity take over fear? And there was actually a recent study that came out that said when you're feeling uncomfortable, asking questions actually helps release some like dopamine and actually makes you feel better. And to be able to ease the tension, if you ask a second question, it releases even more. And I thought that was really fascinating. So if we let like our curiosity take over and we go, hey, listen, I want to ask you questions so I can understand kind of what situation you're in and help you. Hey, even if you don't move here, versus your fear, which is like, I just want to ask you questions that'll kind of set you up for what I want to convince you of. It'll get you a lot further in the sales process. And so, kind of as we go down that and we look at following, like instead of relying on logic and being scared and the facts, let's settle into the emotions. Let's dig into that. Let's be curious about what is their story. Why did they reach out? Why don't they just stay home? Dr. William Miller on our webinar last week said, he goes, when I'm talking to somebody about change, he said, I like to ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to change? Where are you at kind of in the process? And he goes, if somebody says a 5, he goes, I'll ask him, well, why aren't you a 0? Because he said what that does is that really kind of promotes change talk and gets them talking. And so if we could just be curious, if we could be curious and say, listen, I want to ask you questions so I understand your situation and I want to understand how you feel about this. And then I can help guide you, guide yourself through this decision. Things are going to be a lot better for both of us. And so when we think about like how can we use AI to kind of bridge the gap and to be able to fill in some of those blanks, I think there's a number of different ways. I know there's a number of different ways I use it in my process. Not using the FU word, creative follow-up ideas. I love a good summarization. I use AI to record phone calls for podcasts that I'm getting ready to do. And I just sent one out today where I used AI to compile this huge list because we talked for an hour and to be able to read through that was going to be really kind of overwhelming. And I just put it in the chat GPT and said, hey, give me a summary of this. You can use it for research. You can use it to help. Listen, I'm the worst speller and punctuator. And my family full of educators could not be more disappointed in that from me. I use Chat GPT to be able to help me. It doesn't write my emails. I put all of my own words in there, but it helps me with my punctuation and spelling. It can help you with asking better questions based off of what you know about that person, or like Sine said, jump-starting ideas. And so there's a lot of great uses for it. Now, should we be relying on it? No. But is it a tool that we can be able to use to be able to help us in this sales process? Absolutely. It can spark ideas, it can spark questions, it can help you start emails, it can do so much and take some things off your plate when you're so busy to be able to help jumpstart that sales process or even dive into those cold leads that you have that are just kind of sitting there. because guys, your next sale is already in your database. The sales process is a 6 month long process. There's a lot of steps when you look at the data, depending on the level of care, it's anywhere between 24 to 40 touches, not including marketing touches, to be able to move somebody in. So that's all I have for you guys today. Just so you know, all the pictures except this one were actually AI generated in this presentation. Even the really cute 83-year-old lady at the beginning of the presentation, I asked ChatGPT to give me a picture of a cute 83-year-old, and that's what it spit out. So that's another use for it. But if you're interested in more information, I'm on LinkedIn. My email is just reed at oneonone.com, or our website's oneonone.com/academy. So Katie, I appreciate it. I went 1 minute over. I apologize.